The thing that makes StarCraft different from all the other esports is that the truly special players have the ability to influence the metagame in a permanent way that really molds and shapes in ways that it doesn't in other esports. And here we have two guys who are a perfect example of that, two guys who completely changed the way that the PvZ matchup works. This is a 2007 Ever OSL Round of 8 game between Bisu and Savior. Now the reason that both of these players are relevant, and this is especially interesting, it's not just because this Round of 8 game was particularly compelling and this Round of 8 in general was really good. It's because Savior was at the peak of his powers and was really revolutionizing defensive macro Zerg play at this time, and was a huge reason that Zerg players really learned how to beat Terran. In recent StarCraft history, frequently a new build will come out and affect the metagame. For instance, whenever Light came out with that aggressive Valkyrie build versus Zerg, and it was so good that it swung the ZVT win rate to the point where only a handful of Zergs qualified for ASL. Well, after a couple months, Zerg sort of figured it out, and the metagame changed a little bit. That build waned in popularity. Well, back in this time, the core tenets of the game were much less figured out. There was more mystery in terms of how to get from one part of the matchup to the other, one phase of the game to the other, as it were. How do you get from the early mid-game to the mid-game effectively as Protoss, where your natural's safe and your third base is able to be teched into? You've got to understand that back at this time, Zerg had just been revolutionized by Savior, but Protoss versus Zerg was seen as the most lopsided, lunky, imbalanced matchup in favor of Zerg. And it was because, as Day9 once quipped, Protoss would sort of do a weird 2-gate opening that didn't really work, and then they would try to take their natural. Now we see Forge first openings, Nexus first openings. TOS has a lot of different options. Forge Expand was not really common at this time, and as weird as this sounds, the Corsair did not really have a place in the matchup. Now it's standard, right? Protoss players will make Corsairs, whether it's to dominate the skies and they get +1 and they're really invested, which I think is the better way to play and the way I prefer to play this matchup, or they do it almost begrudgingly, where they only get a couple so they don't die to mutas and they can scout around a bit. Well, who invented that? Who invented the concept of opening Corsair? It was Bisu. Bisu invented the concept of opening Corsairs versus Zerg. It was literally not a thing before him. And it was in this era, in this 2007 era, where Bisu did this. I casted a game on my channel from this series a couple years ago, and initially, whenever I saw this game, I thought, have I already done this one? It feels a little familiar. And I was looked back, and it was actually from this series, but it was another game. So in game 1 of this series, Savior wins, and then in game 2 of the series, Bisu goes super heavy Corsairs, dominates the skies, and maintains air advantage, and really dominates in a macro game. And now it's 1-1. Like I said, this is the Ever OSL 2007 Round of 8. The OSL and the MSL were sort of like the GSL or the ASL. They were the premier one-on-one Star League tournaments. And when I say one-on-one, I don't mean as opposed to team games, 2v2. I mean as opposed to Pro League, where you're going out there and trying to all kill and represent your team. It's the standard Star League format that you and I grew up on. Double cannon at the Nexus here, and he's continuing to scout around on this high ground. This map, Fantasy 2, I don't really know much about, to be honest with you. It looks like the third base is relatively easy to take up on this little high ground. It looks a bit like Andromeda. And in this era, you had a lot of this 2007 map era, there weren't maps that had a plethora of expansions. The map Varamir in Brood War that was really popular 3 years ago? It has a ton of expansions. There weren't really big macro maps like that. You had maps like this, where you almost had a little quadrant of 3, and then maybe another little quadrant of 3, but not much in between. Whereas if we think about maps now, usually there's exterior fourth bases to fight over. So what made this game in this series special is that Protoss was seen as a huge underdog to Zerg. Like, yeah, only 3 Protoss qualified for this tournament, but that was because all the Zergs were knocking them out, and they were dying to Ling Bust. And we think about how popular Hydra Bust is in the current meta and how good it is. Protoss players really didn't even have the tools to like scout for and deal with Hydra Bust, in terms of they didn't really like, they didn't open Corsair. What's one of the main ways that you scout now? You send your first Corsair across the map. But they're really playing in the dark. And you can see Bisu understood, okay, I need to try to make sure that it's not Hydra Bust or see what he's making. If you don't know what Hydra Bust is, it's one of the most common and prevalent cheeses in this matchup. And you basically open 3 base as Zerg, get like 9, 7, and 3 drones at bases 1, 2, and 3, and then you basically do a Hydra rush, and the timing hits right at the Protoss' front door as they're teching into Storm. That's sort of the idea. Protoss is in this power trough where they're teching up into Storm, and until Storm finishes and they have a couple Templar, they're very weak. They don't want to build Dragoons. Dragoons are bad against Hydras, and we can see Hydras and Lings coming out to pressure Bisu. Notably, Bisu scouted it, and he's putting more cannons down. He's opened Stargate for Saras, so like it looks like a pretty normal game, but you got to understand back in 07, this was not a normal looking game at all. And Savior was known as a big macro player, not a cheeser, and we saw him put a hatchery down, and he's starting to tech up into lair, and he's perhaps feigning a bit of aggression as he's retreating now. And that's why Hydra Bust is so popular, or at least part of the reason. As Savior sees all those cannons, and note he had a Ling over there scouting around and making sure there were no probe shenanigans going on. It's always good to have a couple Lings laying around, especially by ramps. Prevents your opponent from proxying stuff on you or sneaking a base. And in this instance, Savior is really trying to prevent scouting. And note that he has the double Lings holding up in the main. And like I said, Corsairs were not common, as we see he already has a Robo Bay, which is very fast in this matchup. And so obviously Savior is saying to himself, if I can prevent ground scouting, I'm really preventing all scouting. But because, Bisu is completely revolutionizing the meta with the Corsair here, as weird as that is to sound, I know so many of you who have watched even a little bit of StarCraft and seen this matchup would be like, oh yeah, he's Corsairs, of course. The reason that this game is relevant is this is sort of like the game in these series where Bisu really shows this off in like an ardent, meaningful, memorable way. And it looks like he's going to go Corsair Reaver here, which is one of the most difficult to micro compositions in the whole game. Brutally unforgiving. And Savior tries to push the Sares away. And like I said, this map, weird, and has high ground above the Nat, and you can see that Savior has a Ling over there. A lot of these mid-2000s maps, like 05, 06, 07, a big dynamic of these maps was like huge, weird high ground, and like big, weird high ground in the middle, and the rush distance was a little bit shorter. And like I said, they weren't as expansive. And here we see the 12 o'clock base is an island that has minerals blocking it. And this is what I'm talking about. In every map today, that would just be like a normal fourth. And even in a very obscure map like Roaring Currents, the semi-island map we saw in ASL, which produced decent games. I've played that map personally and think it's a lot of fun. And the reason that it didn't produce better games in ASL is I think Protoss players almost like punted it in terms of they're like, well, I'm not going to truly practice and master this one. I'll just try to go carrier. And you see that a lot with pro gamers where if a weird quirky map comes out in the pool, a lot of them play one game on it, the first game they have on ladder with it, they lose, and they're like, okay, I'm never playing that again. That's stupid. That's a big reason why the StarCraft 2 map pool has grown so insanely stale, is anytime they tried something new, the pro gamers complained about it and essentially refused to play it and just didn't learn it, you know what I mean? Which is crazy because it's directly influenced the uptick in terribly boring maps we've seen in Star 2. They still mix in interesting maps in ASL and in Brood War more so, and in StarCraft 2, we've really seen the metagame get stale in the last few years with the prevalence of the Reaper versus Zerg. Basically, it's so good you're never not going to make it. And all the maps being 2-player and cookie cutter. But this was not like this at all, as Scourge come out and try to fight the Corsairs, and they get a couple. And we see the shuttle coming out here, presumably has double Reaver in it. Now, the thing about Corsair Reaver is it's extremely powerful, but if you lose the shuttle, you lose like all your splash. And the Reaver's out here south side, and the goon that was in the shuttle dies. Oftentimes, you have a goon in the shuttle just to basically tank or scout around a little bit. Like, note, he dropped the goon there first and just left it there to see when the Hydras would come. Really, you just want to load something else up in the shuttle if you're going to do a Reaver drop like that and don't want to wait for the second Reaver. It's like you might as well have something in there. It's useful for sponging shots. And for instance, like against Terran, if they have mines, if they're expecting a Reaver drop or you've already showed it, as we see Savior having Lings burrowed all over the map. This is so insanely intelligent and one of those things that people just don't do enough. And one of those things that's literally been good in StarCraft 1 and 2 and will always be good. And it's one of those things that's just severely underused. Because even if you scout that like, oh, he got Burrow, it's like, okay, so how are you going to address that? Well, I'm going to completely alter my entire play style, make like 4 times as many observers as I usually would, and then like be really diligent about moving the observers around and clearing stuff in random spots, and I'm gonna like rush observer speed. It's like, if a guy is gonna get burrow and burrow stuff all over the map diligently, which we've seen Savior do, which is a phenomenal intelligent play, it's legitimately difficult to address that if they're like going to be very fastidious about it and like really dedicate a lot to it, as you see a DT swipe away there as Savior's trying to drone up. And again, Bisu has managed to get air control. Notably, Savior's Lings are allowing him to see the Corsair movement, but Bisu is being very diligent about moving the Corsairs around and pressuring. And although this looks semi-standard, remember, this is the game that set the standard. Protoss players were dying for like 7 years straight to just random dumb Zerg nonsense. Yeah, Protoss was still able to really pressure Terran and be a big threat in that matchup, but they were very, very flimsy against Zerg. Bisu, with his Bisu build of opening Corsair and then mixing in DT, really revolutionized the meta. And this was the series that people point back to and say, this is like when Bisu changed the meta completely. As we see a storm drop coming in, devastating the mineral line of Savior, just monster moding all those drones, completely wiping his mineral line. And you'll note there that Savior even had a spore. It's so vexing whenever you're like, okay, I know I'm going to get dropped here, I'm going to make static. And they just go around and get basically devastating damage off anyway. Great storm drop there. And one thing about Brood War and like Zerg defense especially is so much of it is based around SimCity, way more so than StarCraft 2. Speaking of SimCity, right at the choke of the exterior fourth he's trying to take, Bisu's stacking up cannons, very good to see. And like I said, the Zerg defense is a lot about building placement in this. And what I mean by that, and this is especially true as another storm drop comes in and eviscerates the mineral line, at least a few drones live that time, is whenever we see the Reaver being spotted on the high ground by the burrowed Ling. And what's crazy about this game is Savior is playing well and Bisu's playing virtually perfectly. But remember, he basically has perfect vision to Savior. Like, he has these Lings burrowed everywhere. He's seeing where the Corsairs are going. He's seeing where the shuttle's going. And it's still so hard to defend because Bisu is all over the map. Keep in mind that Bisu is one of the fastest pro gamers of all time, and the fastest Protoss pro gamer by far. Dan Artosa said that all of those, like, record guys as they play with a video camera standing behind them, videos that he did in Korea, he did a ton of them, stood behind basically every pro gamer and saw like their IRL FPVOD. He said Bisu's was the most impressive, top 3, and then most impressive Protoss by far. So Bisu is incredibly fast and known for his multitask as another storm drop comes down, and it's such a brutal feeling as Zerg when you get storm dropped, lose a bunch, and then the Archon morphs and you don't have enough to deal with it. And it's a funny little thing as toss, especially if your shuttle dies, you're like, okay, well at least I'll have the Archon. And it dies because there were a couple lings hammering away at it while it was morphing. But if there's nothing there while it morphs and then you try to defend it with just lings, a lot of times you can get it behind the mineral line and really abuse the splash. Remember that Savior was seen as an infallible macro Zerg at this time, as the Corsairs are hammering down upon the Overlords. A lot of this matchup now is about like Overlord preservation versus Corsairs, and Zergs have had a ton of practice dealing with it, but again, at this time, this was a completely new thing, and the shuttle running in and just devastating Savior as another Storm Drop is going to come in and macerate the mineral line, as Bisu's doing so well. He's playing this just brilliantly, and you really need to consider that normally in a game, between the Hydra Defense and Scourge, Savior would be fine, and he has the Spore there, but because Bisu went for all these Corsairs, which I can't stress this enough, at this time was unheard of and utterly unorthodox, Savior's like, well, I can't just make a handful of Scourge, or even, you're definitely not going to go Muta, that's even worse. So Bisu's Corsair advantage, which was a revolutionary thing at this time, punches out any air-centric defense and is allowing him to come in with the shuttle and really do work. And we see Bisu understands the power of choke points. He has a bunch of cannons at both of the choke points of his expansions, and then even a DT in the choke too. One of the little things about Brood War that's hard to appreciate if you don't play a lot of it is how hard it is to get stuff up and down ramps. And I'm talking like just about the AI here and getting things to cooperate. It's very difficult. And if a guy has like a certain set of units on top of a ramp, it's like impossible. A bunch of lurkers with an overlord over them. I was talking about Zerg defense being predicated on SimCity, as you see another storm drop and a Scourge flies in and kills the shuttle there, and the High Templar will look around trying to storm something. It'll settle for one Hydra, the most tepid storm of all time. But one thing that Zergs will do is they'll put a natural hatchery there, like a hatch in the choke of their nat, you know? And then they'll sort of put sunks behind that, and anytime Protoss tries to attack a choke, like at the natural, the hatchery will sponge a bunch of the damage as the sunks work away. They'll even put like their Hydra Den in the same choke. But seeing that hatchery there to sponge damage is a big reason that Protoss just doesn't run in with speed zealots and walk you down. Because not only does the hatch protect your sunks, you can also put lurkers there. Another trick you can do is put an overlord over your lurkers that are stacked up so they can't see how many you have. Another trick that you can do is after you put your hatch down, you can put a sunk on the very exterior of the creep and then make that a spore so it kills obs. Of course, whenever they have storm, you got to be careful about stacking units, but you can make this like very tight, hard to forward defense as Zerg. And a Goon Reaver army is sliding down into Savior here, and Savior throws up double Dark Swarm, and look at that, blood everywhere as the Reaver just eviscerates the ground army, and Savior flies in here 1A, 2A, 3A with his Hydras, but remember, Reavers are unaffected by Dark Swarm because the Scarab is like considered a unit and not just like an attacking shot. So between a couple storms at the end and a ton of Reaver splash, Hydras get macerated, but the following wave of Zerglings will force Bisu to retreat. He'll probably retreat up onto this high ground. Whenever you get down to just goons, things get very tenuous. You always have to have supporting units. So Bisu, of course, is macroing at home. He's waiting for his next wave of stuff to come up, and he's doing the classic micro that honestly, like, he's sort of famous for having great goon micro where you attack, step back, and that's really more in the Terran matchup where that's like more of a skillful thing because mines are involved. Like Bisu's famously good at that, and in general, he's known for being incredibly fast, having great micro and great macro. Anyone you'll talk to who will tell you he's a top 3 toss of all time, and many people will tell you he's the best ever. His Savior is screaming up here with Hydraling and Psystorm blanket the army, and some goons are left, and unfortunately Bisu is going to be pushed back. More Zealot High Temp coming up. Note that another storm drop here punching out the drones of Savior, and any time that Savior is doing an attack like this and he loses a mineral line, it can't be overstated like how much momentum that cost him. Because in these moments when he sort of crescendos with the drone count and wants to do a big attack, He wants to keep enforcing his Scourge, clear out the shuttle there, but he does a big attack, he wants to make a reinforcement wave, and then he wants to keep pressuring. Whenever a mineral line gets wiped while he's doing an attack, the attack peters out. Okay, exasperated sigh. Now I have to make a wave of drones. That's like 40 seconds wasted. Bisu gets momentum back. He's saturating his exterior bases. He's teching up. Now when I make a wave of units, Bisu has steadied himself and is fine. Whereas a lot of what he was trying to do was sort of like snowball his advantage, attack him in multiple spots, wear him down with spells. But because Bisu always has like a counter punch for the Zerg aggression, which was very uncommon in this era, Savior isn't able to do exactly what he wants. Note the Scourge, like snuffed out here. The fact that the Corsair count was maintained is noteworthy. It prevents mass drop play from getting game-ending damage. It prevents a muta-switch from occurring. And I love that he got +1 as he was moving the Sares around and he scouts this huge Doom drop. And the Doom drop for Zerg, one of the most devastating maneuvers you can do, is note that Savior had some Scourge with that too. Anytime you do a big drop like this, you want to bring some Scourge in case it does get intercepted and really try to force your hand. And Bisu is going to have a hard time defending this because remember, this is that choke point that he fastidiously defended with all those cannons. So in the same way that it's like a long, insufferable walk around for Zerg, it's the same for him. And that's part of what makes this such a good base to drop, as Savior knows, well, I'm never going to get up into there naturally, really. Even with like Dark Swarm, it would be arduous to push up that ramp, so he just went around. And speaking of arduous and ramps, double Reaver up on this high ground. Thankfully, shuttles are there to juggle the Reavers. If you just leave the couple Reavers, it's a cute little defense, especially if they're behind cannons, but you don't want them to get dove. And the Ling burrowed beneath the Reaver is sort of instrumental in spotting them there and preventing the Hydras from losing range. And remember, the reason that Dark Swarm isn't as good against Toss as it is against Terran isn't just Storm, but also Zealots and like some of the Archon splash works. Whereas so little of your damage works is Terran since you don't have a melee unit, that Dark Swarm is more of like, oh, he swarmed, alright, I've got to back up. Like, even if you spam a bunch of fire bats, it's just so oppressive. Swarm, of course, is very good and useful in this matchup, but also Zerg is like usually way more Hydra-centric, and Hydras can't fire under Storm, you know, they don't hit anything, you know what I'm saying? And Bisu is surging westbound here, and he sort of has that scary Protoss army that just scales so well and is upgraded well enough where you're really going to struggle as Zerg to take a good engagement into all this splash. Storm being thrown out to the point where a Reaver dies before it can really do anything. And you can see all the blood on the map as the Zerg army just gets macerated there, as the Lurkers are sort of spread out all over the base in a very defensive macro way. And whenever you are losing fights for like 10 straight minutes and the Toss is picking at you and constantly expanding, your army is not going to be able to hang with the Toss army. Bisu is able to really just crush with all of his splash and not take any damage on his money units. And the big fight that they had, Savior just got all of his stuff wiped with splash and then really didn't have recourse. There was just so much Storm and Reaver action that Bisu sort of walked him down. The big drop that he did was his ace in the hole. He had been denied and pushed back. Bisu had out-expanded him, and he really needed that drop to do game-ending damage, or at least kill that base and some cannons and get high ground control. And because the Corsair count was still so high, Bisu was able to deny that. Remember, in a normal PvZ in this era, not only there's probably not going to be any Corsairs, but if there are, they're not going to be like diligently maintained and microed. As we see Storm dumpstering the mineral line. This is really what Bisu is most famous for, is his ability to maintain his Corsairs, his high APM. Like, yeah, he invented Corsair use versus Zerg, but it's like, holy crap, what you really have to consider is it's like how fast he was with it, how he obnoxiously hunted down overlords with higher APM than everyone else. Like, it wasn't just the fact that he was like, oh, you go Corsairs and they don't have detection for DTs. It was the consistency and the control he did it with. His Savior is really trying to make sort of a last-ditch effort here, as Bisu is stomping all over the map and really making his presence felt. And this is the rubber match of the round of 8. So whoever wins this advances in the tournament. And remember, Savior was seen as a favorite. He's at the peak of his powers, and PvZ is Super Zerg favorite at this time. This isn't just an important game in the history of StarCraft, but this is really one that changed the meta. This was a series that people circle and point back to and say, this is when Bisu changed the meta, as we see Storm blanketing everything here. And it's a terrible feeling as Zerg when you start to see Archons presented in over quantities of 6. Of course, they just do so much brutal splash, and you're not going to be able to Dark Swarm your way through it, and you're not going to be able to plague them down either, as GG occurs. And it's like, my goodness, I can't believe I lost that after winning the opening game, and Bisu does it, man. Beginning of an era. So I know it's been a while since the last vid. Make sure you sub for more. Stay easy.